Hello. I think we're live. Hopefully, we are. Can anyone hear me? Hope you're all doing well. I've been doing decently. I mean, I wanted to do a stream specifically on any topic, and I guess I want to stream more often because the last stream that I did was a great stream. If you haven't seen it, I definitely recommend you watch it. I mean, the Mario Brothers of Orthodoxy really killed it. I think they did a great job. On the other hand, I think it's just been such a long time since I've talked for more than an hour in English that I kind of forgot. Like I'm pretty much rusty. Um, my fitness, I suppose, for long-winded conversations in English has been, I don't know, it's been going down. So I kind of think it's a good idea that if I just keep practicing, right, like use the streams as an excuse to practice, and also obviously talk about important things like we're going to be talking about in the stream today. So let's see if hello, merhaba. Okay. Please tell me if the sound is good. Right, we're watching from Orthodox Serbia. Thank you. Yeah, excellent. Um, yeah, please let me know if my sound is good because last stream the volume on my microphone was low and I noticed it like in the middle of the stream. And another thing is that like because we were in space, my phone is kind of strained. Like it's kind of weird. In Twitter Spaces, it goes into like when my phone has the microphone, it automatically goes into like a phone conversation mode, and you can't mute. Like you can lower it to a certain minimum, but you can't go lower than that. And it was around here, and I thought, oh, I guess people aren't hearing me. And halfway through the stream, I heard like I saw someone talk about, oh, there's echo in the background whenever David speaks, and I thought, okay, I'm not hearing the echo from Mario. I'm not hearing it from Luigi. It's got to be from me. So, and please let me know if there's any problems with the sound so I can fix it immediately, fix it quick as I can. Other than that, so I guess I'll ask the people in the chat first. What did you think about, if any of you have seen the video? I mean, it's super popular. It's been out for less than a week, I think. I'm not sure. It has already more than 2 million views. I mean, it's super popular. It's I bet people are talking about this, and there's already a couple of response videos against it. Alex O'Connor, one atheist versus 25 Christians. I mean, my immediate thoughts. I'll also listen to what the chat says. We could kind of exchange some ideas on this, but my immediate thought was not like even about whether Alex's arguments were good or like anyone's arguments were good. I just thought the format was horrible. I thought I thought the format was just terrible, and it was completely advantageous to Alex. If you asked me about anything, like let's say you're going to be talking about anything, would you prefer to be solo or would you prefer to be one of the 25 in this specific format? I will 100 times out of 100, I will always say I just prefer to do solo. I'd prefer to be the one person against 25. Okay, no matter the level of the people that I'm debating, because when you're one of the 25, you're not just you're debating one person, right? When you're one, you're always debating one person at a time. When you're one of the 25, you're debating the one person, and also you're trying to convince the 24 others, right? The 24 other people that you're worth listening to. And that's horrible because I thought like a quarter of the people were just like haters. Like they'd always raise the flag up and they'd all say, no, stop talking, I want to talk. Like it's like people just did not want anyone, like no matter how sophisticated or smart they were. Like there were like a couple of people that they let like talk for a specific amount of time, and then they say, okay, it's time for you to stop. um, and just like 20 minutes on like a specific claim. I mean, all of these claims that we're going to be going over, I mean, you can have an entire like 2 hour debate on these claims, just on these claims, and it's just 20 minutes. And um, I thought If someone asks, why not challenge him? I mean, I challenged Alex O'Connor, but I mean, I don't really think that he's going to say, "Oh, this guy with 19,000 subscribers challenges me. I gotta have a debate with him." I don't think that's gonna happen. I mean, I just like to me, it's just I don't like the whole WWEification of like the debate space as well. Like, it's not my thing. But I hope you understand like what I'm talking about. I don't think the format is good. I will much prefer if it was just one on one with anyone. If it was just one on one with any guy from the street. And another thing is that many of the people are just making horrible arguments, right? Like there's like two people specifically, like both of them women. Like one of them was kind of just like relatable because her whole thing was like Jesus appeared to me when I was 3 years old, and ever since I've been Christian. I mean, on the one hand, it's nice. It's nice to hear such stories. On the other hand, like this is a debate. Like I don't care, like that's not going to change. That really it's a good motivation for someone who already believes, and it can also be a good motivation for someone who doesn't believe but has a disposition, right? For someone who's trying to do a debate, it's just not an argument. So why are you bringing it up? You know what I mean? Like it's literally not an argument. So that, and another thing is uh like it wasn't even not like the people in there weren't even Christian, and I'm not even talking about the progressive Christians. Like one of the guys, he had like a typical like Christian progressive dad face, you know and he was like talking about, oh, my Jewish friend said this, and the halabunga, and like again, what does that have to do with anything? I just kind of thought a lot of there are some people, they weren't professionals or anything. There were some people that made good arguments, right? Um, there's this one guy, like white guy with an orange shirt, I think. He had decent arguments. There's this other guy who referenced Michael Heiser. He had good arguments. The problem is his presentation was incredibly weak. He just didn't. I don't think he believed what like, or he wasn't really sure. I think he appeared on Inspiring Philosophy's debate review. Um, but yeah, that's just basically like the general kind of understanding I had is I think it was just advantageous for Alex. It's always going to make him look good, even if he like happened to make a bad argument. It's always going to make him look good, right? Because it's going to be the other person that's going to try to go, no, no, no. You need to you think of it this way, right? It's always going to be the other person that's going to do the convincing. And some people in the early parts, they try to like flip the tables, but Alex is making a claim about a specific thing, and then he's asking, "You're an atheist. What do you believe about morality?" It's like, you know, I understand that's a good, that's a good instinct, but when you're making claim about something, right? When you're making an internal critique, you can't really say, "But what do you think?" Right? That's at that point you're supposed to give an internal consistency report. So I guess some people are talking about Alex is going to apparently debate David Wood. Um, Yeah, I don't think that's going to be a good debate. Uh, a Mormon dictating what is and what isn't Christianity is a wild thing to watch. Yeah, I think that was deliberate. I don't think that was accidental. I think that was super deliberate. Like I think they intentionally put the Mormon guy, like he was the only sophisticated. Oh, look at this Mormon. He's so sophisticated, unlike these like creedal Christians. And what like Mormons dictating what Christians, Mormons aren't Christians. I'm not saying this in a polemical way. It's objective that Mormons aren't Christians. Um, and I think most of the people in the audience know me. For me, the only Christian is an Orthodox Christian. Like I am very exclusivist, right? People don't like this, but um, that's pretty much. Of course, there's qualifications, but Mormons objectively aren't Christians because they deny many of the core tenets of Christianity that other Christian bodies accept. For example, the Trinity, the divinity of Christ. There's a lot of denial of, I mean, the denial of the Trinity is an explicit one, I think. Um, yeah. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I debated chat. Like, even if, yeah, I debated Chat GPT. I mean, yeah, I mean, even if this is just like you trying to be funny, it's like no one's laughing. It's not funny. Anyways, so yeah, I don't think that was coincidental. I think that was intentional. I think the people at Jubbilee tried to They try to be smart, and I don't think that was fair. So I guess we can kind of start now. We already got a couple of people. I mean, 90 people. That's already more than I'm used to with live streams, but things might have changed. I mean, we're about to hit 20,000 soon. I think that's quite nice. So before I start, I just want to give a thank you to the Patreon supporters, the financiers, those who financially support this channel. Thank you to Ferdinand, Alex, not Alex O'Connor, maybe Alex O'Connor, Alex Orthodox. Thank you, Scott, Robert, Bone, Tony, John, Marcus, Carter, Anastasios, Marco, Vander, Peyton, Sean, Marco, Died Soul Light, Eddie, Node, Maximus, Vlad, Nectaris, Dave, Norbert. Thank you for supporting me. If you want to become one of those, you can check the Patreon link in the description below. We can start with the arguments. I suppose we can start with the arguments that the claims rather that Alex O'Connor makes. I suppose we can go chronologically. The one that really struck me is the whole like Jesus never claimed to be God. That to me is, especially if you even somewhat affirm that the gospel authors believed what they were writing. Like he basically took the red letter argument. Like for those who don't know, there's some Protestant Bibles that are just like that have every time Jesus speaks, it's always in red, right? The red letter. So that's a term that some people refer to them with. It's basically the red letter approach. Like, okay, maybe the gospel authors believe Jesus was God, but Jesus never claimed to be God, right? That's like the main argument that he uses. Like that to me was striking. And I think if you look at the general mechanism in which Alex and atheists like him typically work with, no matter how sophisticated they might be, ultimately they don't really know nor even really care about Christian theology. The problem is that actually knowing the theology is kind of a prerequisite to know whether the gospel and Christ himself is referring to himself as God and other Christian claims. The reason for that is especially Christianity, in contrast to, I will say, especially Islam, is that Christianity doesn't work with just apparent meaning of the text, telling you and dictating you what the religious faith is. In many instances, the various key doctrines are emphasized and defined in very symbolic and very elaborate ways, right? Ways in which you will actually need to know some things at the very least relate to Christian theology. I'm not just talking about stuff you can find on Wikipedia. I'm talking about like knowing the Old Testament, knowing the typologies present within the Old Testament, how it's applied in the New Testament, and how, for example, Christ appropriates those typological understandings. One of those people, for example, like he cited Michael Heiser. He was going on the right track, right? He pointed out that Yahweh, right, God appropriated a symbolic, I will say, a symbolic feature that Baal had, right, like being the cloud god, right, riding the clouds. Yahweh appropriated that for himself. God appropriated that for himself. And in Daniel 7, we have the Son of Man being featured with that signification that is exclusive to God, right? And he tried to make the argument, look, Christ himself is explicitly making that connection. So the Son of Man is God, and Christ himself is claiming that he being the Son of Man, him being the Son of Man, is the one who's ruling together with, God. Of course, the delivery that the person made, unfortunately, was very weak. Aside from that, Alex's rebuttal was kind of like, yeah, but Daniel is Jewish and he doesn't believe in the Trinity. Okay. That's really not a good response. Anyways, kind of going on, like being sidetracked a little bit. I'm going to kind of go chronologically, right? Like how the video goes. I was thinking maybe I could play a couple of sound clips or video clips, but I don't know how to do it with StreamYard, because when I try to do it with the StreamYard, you have to show the video footage, and I don't want to show the video footage on the stream for many reasons. I don't really want to do that. Main reason is YouTube doesn't like that. So I'm just going to try to rephrase the argument or summarize the argument that was being made. So there's a general claims, and then within the claims that were made within the video, there were some subordinate claims, so to speak, or debates that were going on. So the first argument that Alex O'Connor is making is that suffering makes God's existence unlikely. So when I first read this, I thought, okay, this this is the typical problem of evil argument. It's not. It's kind of like a different if it's a different argument that he's trying to make. But in the last part, so we got to move to the last part of the video for a little bit. When he was doing that one-on-one debate with the Mormon guy, right? Like he wanted to pick from one of the 25 on who like that he is going, and he was going to have a 10-minute debate with him, right? On any topic. He chose the Mormon guy. He didn't know he was the Mormon guy. Then the Mormon guy gave this whole spiel. It's like, oh, I'm, a lot of Christians might not like me because I'm Mormon. Like he drops the bomb. I think that whole thing was staged. Like it wasn't just like Alex wasn't there because I guess he really wanted to talk with him, but I don't think that whole thing was, again, I don't think that was a coincidence. I think there were some aspects of something being ran there, but they didn't really argue much, mostly because of time. But there was a debate about the problem of evil. So I think Alex himself admits this, that there is, although the problem of suffering is not the same as the problem of evil, there's an admission that they are very much connected. So I think it will be a good idea to kind of give a two-pronged approach to the problem of evil, and then from that we can move on to the problem of suffering. So the problem of suffering argument that Alex makes is that suffering in many cases in the ways we've seen in the world really seems unnecessary, right? The suffering of animals specifically, right? Like animals in terms of natural selection, these animals, they suffer unnecessarily, right? There's no need for them to suffer. They just there's predator-prey relations, that kind of stuff. And this is connected to the problem of evil because the Mormon guy argues, well, it's actually logically inconsistent to have a world without suffering if you're going to have created things, right? That's the general gist that I understood. So I want to kind of expand on that and give an argument for the problem of evil, right? So it's a greater claim. So it's not just addressing the problem of suffering, it's addressing the problem of evil. We go to the problem of evil first, then we're going to move on to the suffering aspect, which it's going to be short, okay? But the problem of evil, I want to kind of expand on it. It's a two-tiered approach that I want to take. The first is kind of more, I would say, philosophical, right? Like using broad philosophical categories, especially in terms of moral perfection. The main theme of the problem of evil argument is that you can't have an omnipotent God who allows for evil things to happen. It will be better for him to prevent those evil things to happen. The short answer, I will say, is such a thing does not have potency. Such a thing, that is, it created beings being morally perfect as God is a logical impossibility. You will never have such a world that could be the case. You could have morally perfect beings, which is how you have saints in heaven, right? But they become perfect, right? It's a state of becoming. It's a state of change. They become perfect over time, right? But they can never be created perfect from the beginning. And whatever moral perfection they have, it is through grace and not according to nature. And because it is not according to nature, they can't start perfect. So the basic theme is, if we're talking about God as the perfect being, being morally perfect is one of those natural properties that is proper to him exclusively. And since God is simple, he's not made of parts, he doesn't have some kind of natural property that is shared between some other being, right? It is exclusive to him. It's not shared by any other being, which is why he's simple, right? He's not made of parts. That's at least an account of simplicity that I'm working with. And if you had created beings that were morally perfect from the get-go, they will have something in common with God according to nature. So it's a logical impossibility. Creatures become morally perfect according to grace, right? Which in Orthodox theology, grace is a divine energy. It's distinct from the divine essence, and distinct from Western Christianity. It is uncreated grace. It is a grace that God has according to his own nature that we participate in. It's not a created reflection of the uncreated grace or something like that, like you have in Latin, Western Christianity and Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. So that's the first step of the argument, is that ultimately when we talk about omnipotency, right? Omnipotency just means infinitely actualizing anything that has potency. But things that are incomprehensible or nonsensical or contradict the laws of logic, which the laws of logic are a reflection of God's nature, right? So God doesn't contradict himself. God, for example, God exists. God cannot, for example, cease to exist, right? existence is a reflection of a natural characteristic of him. Um, so logic is one of those things. People sometimes say like God is bound by laws of life. I don't like that kind of terminology because it makes it seem as if the laws of logic is above and God is below it. It's really the other way around. But because it's the other way around, that God is, I will say, semantically bound by laws of logic, if that makes sense. So with that out of the way, you can the main question is it possible to create a world in which there are created beings that never commit evil? Evil is not a substance, it's not an ontologically existing thing. It's like darkness and light, right? Darkness is the privation of light. So evil is the privation of good. But there's no scenario where you're going to have creatures, created beings, created rational beings with free agency that will be morally perfect all the time from the get-go. In Orthodox theology, there's a two-tiered understanding of this. There's the image of God. This is according to nature, right? Image of God means that human beings have the properties of God in a created mode. So God has personhood, man has personhood. God has will, mind, intellect. Man also has will, mind, intellect, right? Um, so, God has life, for example. Man has created life, right? Created rational life. So that's the image of God. And then you have the likeness of God, which is, I will say, signified by the hypostasis, by the person, right? So there's a distinction between nature and person. And so mapping onto that, corresponding to that distinction, there's a distinction between the image of God and the likeness of God. The likeness of God is lost in the garden because of Adam's sin. Likeness, you can think of it as um, participating in the virtues of God. So, for example, when we talk about God as the good, the virtues are the various, one can say, aspects of the good, right? So compassion, love, chastity, right? Justice, all of these are virtues that are natural to God, that man participates them. And this is being like God, right? And this is something that the saints, for example, do, right? They participate in them and they become like God. Um, as a result, that's basically, on a simple way, that's basically the Orthodox mapping. So I will say this is a decent answer to the problem of evil, ultimately, because, and I'm saying this as someone, like, I've been thinking about this pretty much ever since I understood the concept of God, like ever since I was a kid. To me, it was very difficult to understand why evil could be a thing where when you have God, right? Like a perfect being. But once you kind of understand the omnipotence correctly, you can understand, okay, so is it logically possible? We need to ask this question. Is it logically possible? If it isn't, well, that's the problem of evil answered, right? But in what way isn't? Because it's very, you can go to the other extreme, like Origen did, who argued that man could always fall, right? There's this concept of eternal fall, and then you can rise up back again. That's not true, right? Like once you participate in God's virtues by grace, right, you do become morally perfect, right? Saints are morally perfect beings, right? In the afterlife, they have become perfect, right? So they participate in that state eternally. But again, you can't start that way because it's a process. It's definitionally a process that you have to practice, right? And you practice by uh, choosing the good in spite of evil. And so, why, for example, did God create a world in which he knew evil was going to happen so that good can triumph over evil? And what's the best case for that? The crucifixion and the resurrection, right? It's a clear example. It's the clearest example of that. And the second coming is going to bring about the universal restoration of that. So now this gets us to the question of the problem of suffering. A lot of the people made a very good point that you need to look at this in a holistic sense, right? The animals, sure, they are suffering as a result of original sin, right? Because of original sin, because of Adam's sin, all of this suffering occurs, right? Uh, Earthquakes, predator-prey relations, all of these things are a result of original sin. So Adam is the one responsible for all of these things happening, right? That's the first thing that we need to talk about. The second thing, however, is that in a wider context, right? Like one of them made the point is that, uh, when they look at the grand scope of things, they're going to be happy that all of this happened. And Alex asked, I think he asked this, like this was going on in 518, right? Like he was making a good argument, but then he says, I'm talking about in the context of this life. No, universal restoration means that all of creation is redeemed. So it means that Christ, in recapitulating all of creation, which is a concept that St. Paul actually does talk about, Christ, by recapitulating all of creation as being the firstborn of the dead, he recapitulates and restores all of creation. This means all of creation, including animals, right? So animals won't be, they won't be, they're not in heaven right now. But I will say, when all creation is restored, they're going to be part of paradise, because it's all of the things that existed that went wrong is going to be right again. And again, Alex's question, well, why can't this happen without all of the suffering? Well, I just explained why that's the case by explaining the problem of evil. It's impossible for there to be a world in which you have morally perfect beings that never commit sin. No such scenario is possible. You're always going to have moral imperfection. That is, you're always going to have sin when you create human beings, because of the very nature of human beings, not because they are evil, but because they are not perfect as God is, not a perfect being as God is. So that's kind of how I would couch. I think that goes beyond the first firstborn of the dead, who was Lazarus. Yeah, I mean, Elijah also again, this is a problem that a lot of people have. I mean, Elijah also resurrected the dead. As far as I know, firstborn of the dead is a reference to preeminence, and it's also a reference to Christ as being the firstborn of the dead, resurrecting, meaning that all human beings, right, will also inherit the resurrection because he's the firstborn of the dead. That's the concept. Okay, it doesn't mean that Christ was the first person ever in human history to. I mean, you have Lazarus, right? Yeah, as you said. So, firstborn of the dead. I mean, it's, as far as I remember, St. Paul talks use that term. So that's the intention of the term that I will say. So we can move on to the second claim that Alex makes, which is basically God commands genocide in the Bible. I was surprised. I don't know if pleasantly or unpleasantly. I was surprised that a lot of people are saying, "Well, yeah, he did." I think the problem is that the term is really something that comes about very, very recently. Using this term back in time, it is kind of anachronistic. At the same time, I mean, I suppose you can use it, but the problem is the term also has moral weight to it, right? And it's very wrong to keep that moral weight, right? Morality, in its essence, never changes over time. It's still the same. What we speak of morality are virtues, by the way, right? So I will say orthodoxy, I mean, is closer to virtue ethics than, for example, deontology, like what you see in Kant. Orthodoxy, definitely not Kantian. I will say definitely not utilitarian. Absolutely not. It's more corresponding closer, but this doesn't mean, of course, we are. I would say again, orthodoxy is above the kind of philosophical explanation of virtue ethics and what you see in the literature. Just to keep myself safe, right, in that regard. But and what morality is, you have the virtues, right? The virtues always remain the same, but there's also always context, right? The context of what is the moral thing to do and with certain activities, it's something that does change over time, right? It's not something that always stays. I think like a lot of the sexual sins, for example, obviously, I'm not going to say something silly like, oh, this was a sin back then, now it isn't. No, but a lot of it was heavier at that time. I mean, for example, if you go to 500s, it's a lot more difficult to GFY, if you know what I mean. It's a lot more difficult to do that compared to today, right? And so this is something that you need to kind of consider. But at the same time, again, it's the virtues, what are virtues, what are vices, it's still exactly the same. So I think when you import a modern term into an ancient time and you keep that moral weight, I think you're going it's completely anachronistic, right? You can use the term, the bare term as it is, but again, this is a claim, right? This is the claim behind the claim is ultimately that how can such a God commit, like allow for such a thing? So we need to kind of consider that, right? What is genocide? Like what can be considered to be good genocide today? At that time, you can't really again hold at the same moral weight. Uh, so that's one thing. Obviously, um, actually, to move on to the point that I'm about to make is that with that forward being made, some of the examples, the two main examples he uses, the people of Ai, I think, and the people of Amalek. Okay, Amalek. It's a famous case. Amalekites are not humans. Like, I'm not saying this, like, they are literally not humans according to Bible. According to the Bible, they're literally not human beings. As in, I'm not saying this in some racist or no, they're not humans, they're Nephilim. Okay, they are semi-human at most. They're not really human beings. They are beings that came about as a result of um, rituals of lewd intent. They came about as a result of rituals of lewd intent, right? That's their origin, basically. And many of them, for example, Goliath was a giant. Goliath was not a human being. Okay, so I think you can really kind of easily evade this problem by saying, look, these people are not human. They're not human. Um, they're a completely different species, right? And so it's no different than, for example, getting rid of, uh, you know, farming animals. I guess it's different from that, but you get the point that I'm trying to make, right? Now, not all of the people in this case are Amalekites. I'm just saying some of them that are completely annihilated, they are Amalekites, and that's why, for example, he cites Samuel, like Prophet Samuel. Why didn't you destroy all of them? The reason why he is crazed about it is not because um, you know, the prophet is a genocidal maniac that wants people to be killed. It's not because of that. It's because he's completely and fully aware. Look, these people are literal, like, physical manifestations in some sense of demons, and you let them get away. I mean, what's wrong with you? Just because you want to get a little richer? I mean, that completely doesn't make any sense, right? That's the point Prophet Samuel is making. So he completely decontextualizes. Again, this is why I explained you kind of need to know a little bit about Christian theology in order to understand what Scripture teaches and what Scripture tells you. Um, and many of the early church fathers, by the way, many of the early church fathers interpreted the sons of God in Genesis to be the Nephilim, right? And that these people were the Nephilim, right? So this is not some fringe weird theory that I'm coming up with, and a couple of other mystic people are coming up with. This is something that you actually do see in apostolic Christianity. Most of the church fathers, there were some, but most of the church fathers speak of the Nephilim, right? These are real existent beings, right? So a lot of the bad stuff that you talk about is talking about these people, right? In a sense, it's no different than cutting it. And of course, there's a spiritual significance because many of these nations, right, the gods of the nations are demons, right? And so it's also a symbolic reference to spiritual warfare, how we're supposed to cut apart or vices. Now, again, in terms of human tribes that we're talking about, okay, but here there are some other examples of human tribes. A way to think about it again is that the rhetoric, and again, there are some people that made good arguments about it. They basically said it's hyperbole, right? So I want to kind of expand on the hyperbole point a little bit, um, especially the Bronze Age understanding of like the way of speaking is talking about in especially in the context of God, like in the Bible. It's talking about utterly and annihilating and destroying the nation to the point that the nation does not come about again, and that the people within that nation does not reproduce. Okay, that's the basic idea. Um, so that's the language of all the women and the children. It's basically saying eradicate all traces of this nation. Why? Because these nations were demon worshipping nations doing various different ritual sacrifices, like sacrificing infants to some demonic deity, and various different other satanic ritualistic practices that existed at that time, that had a consequence on the ontological state of human beings at that time, right? To the point where all of the human beings and all of the cattle were poisoned by sin. And remember, this is prior to the crucifixion of Christ. This is prior to Christ's coming. So we're talking about people who could not be redeemed or healed in a way that we can be healed today, right? Think of it in this way, right? Because again, a lot of these people that have problems with these passages, they always think of this in terms of like modern sensibilities. And that's a very wrong way to understand. When you're talking about the Bronze Age, okay? Like go to the worst prison, like the prison with the worst convicts that you can ever think of, like the absolute worst people. They have this society going around. And stay with them for a week if you can survive, and then let me know your thoughts, right? You're going to see exactly that a lot of these people don't listen to reason. When you try to teach them that, hey, maybe being this violent, insane criminal is not a good thing for you to do. Maybe graping your inmates are not, maybe you shouldn't be doing that. You just, me no understand the feeling that he have. Me when me see him, me wanna take him. There's a literal clip of a guy, like I think it was a documentary, like a guy who literally could not even understand the concept of empathy. He could not even understand the idea that a person other from himself can feel certain emotions from the consequences of his own. He could not even grasp that, right? And a lot of people are, oh, it's because he's unintelligent. I think I think there are other reasons too, right? Like some people generally do become this way. We're talking about these kinds of people, right? From birth, they become like this, not because of genetical, it's because of sin, right? Ultimately, that's one aspect, right? In this prison analogy that I'm working with, you can have a couple of people that actually do have some kind of sound reasoning. Maybe they can see the way, right? They can see the true way. And I want to talk about these kinds of people in this specific analogy because the reason why this language is hyperbolic is ultimately because the converts, as a result of this war, right? And many of them were forced conversions, but many of these converts, uh, it wasn't needed to end them, basically. There are examples in the Old Testament where one of them basically, spies for the Israelites. They become an Israelite, right? So becoming an Israelite is not done because you're part of some ethnic tribe. In fact, it's not very ethnic at all. To become an Israelite, if you're a man, you need to be circumcised. If you're circumcised, you become an Israelite, right? So this is the case with various different tribes that were annihilated, but the people of those tribes still lived as Israelites because they converted. If you're a woman, you marry to an Israelite. Now, in the case of a war, you're going to be held as a war captive, right? But remember, we're talking about the Bronze Age, and one of the things that the Old Testament shows us, right, in terms of the particular moral judgment of God, which we must distinguish it from the general moral principles, which we see particularly in many instances in the New Testament, also at times in the Old Testament too, like loving your enemies, right? It's actually taught in the Old Testament as well. It's one of the things that we need to consider. So the point that I'm trying to make is that with this scheme at hand, the woman that were held as captives, right? In the Bronze Age, the typical way of doing things in this regard was to basically have a bunch of concubines, right? You take them from the war, you make them your concubine. In the Old Testament, it actually teaches you, if you want to have this woman, you're supposed to marry her, and she's protected by certain rights dictated in the Old Testament that at the time for the Bronze Age, within the context of Bronze Age, were like super ultra progressive. I don't like using the word progressive at all, but super ultra progressive, right? So I'm not trying to make a different argument. I'm trying to argue that within this destruction is included also conversion. That's what I'm trying to get at, right? So the people that had some semblance of reason within those tribes were not physically destroyed. Their lives, right? Their old man were destroyed. The old man was destroyed. The new man was reborn, right? So that's one thing that we need to consider very importantly. And the third thing, in terms of like the innocence that we're also, the man, woman, children, I will say, even if we're talking about, okay, this is including children, we need to understand that the resurrection, like from the context of the resurrection, especially in the Old Testament, this is not seen as this person is gone away or this person is suffering unjustly. It is considering, you're going to see this person again, right? In fact, in the book of Job, something really interesting is that Job gets the double of everything that he had. He had 11 kids, and part of the double for his children is that he gets 11 kids, right? He doesn't have 22 kids. He gets 11 kids because the 11 is part of the previous 11, which he will see them in the day of the resurrection, right? So he gets everything in double in terms of material possession, except for, no, including the children, right? Because now he has 22 children, because 11 more were born. So you get this point, hopefully, that I'm trying to make. So the whole, again, like God commands. Okay, is this really the case? Again, you need to really understand how are we supposed to understand this term. Even if we use the term as it is and import it back into time, the moral weight, like there's certain considerations that you must have that's going to be very, very different. And I think that's the trick that you see being made when people make this argument. And I and also I will kind of announce, I do plan on making an expanded video on the whole like war and the difficult to understand verses in the Old Testament, especially in light of Father Stephen DeYoung's book, God is a Man of War. So I'll do that soon. I don't know exactly when, but it's something that I have in the works. So that's kind of one of the plans that I have in mind. And I think, and yeah, and yeah, Alex O'Connor makes, I think in 41:15, he cites the passage, "Do not intermarry with them." So that's something that's another thing that needs to be explained, right? Because some people might think, oh, but the Bible says you shouldn't intermarry with these people. Now you're saying that there was intermarriage. Well, actually, intermarriage within the context of the Old Testament is referring to marriage within the practices of the person that you're marrying to. Okay, so for example, if you have an Israelite man marrying a Canaanite woman as a result of conquest, for example, right, a man like the woman and says, "I'm going to take you as my wife," and he takes her as his wife, and in this scenario, the marriage is supposed to be done completely and purely in Israelite fashion, right? That's not intermarriage in the sense of what we see in the Old Testament, right? That's intermarriage in the sense that we use the term today. Again, don't use the term. If you're going to use the term in the old context, you have to modify at certain points because these things change over time. Okay, they're not completely static. These things change over time. Any good historian, any good philosopher, any good person who's looking at history is supposed to be doing it. If he doesn't do that, then he's completely failed at doing a historical analysis. I'm sorry, but this is the case. I see this in many instances, especially with like debates of theology, Roman Catholics, Orientals. Like this happens all the time. They always fail to analyze specific church fathers, the way in which they use language, the way in which they use concepts, and they always think that they all use the same concept in the same exact way. Again, this is not. You're supposed to be deeper than that. They can come to the same exact conclusions. Even those who come to the same exact conclusions have certain points in which they conceptually, they differ in semantics, right? You need to catch that difference in semantics, and the way in which you do that is to actually read them instead of reading some secondary scholar or listening to a YouTube video of a guy talking about them. You're supposed to actually read them. Even if you're listening to me, you're supposed to be doing this. Okay, you're supposed to be doing this. So it's the same case here, right? So do not intermarry with them. It means don't marry them according to their customs, right? Because we're trying to eliminate these customs. We're trying to eliminate the culture. An example that I would like to use, in like generally speaking, is like, you can say at that day, in 1945, in this day, there was not a single Nazi left, right? Is this a true statement? Yes. But is it a literally true statement? I mean, you still had a lot of Nazis in Germany. You had many of them going to the United States as scientists, right? Many of them remained, many of them. So it's talking about the whole, right? The nation is destroyed, right? That's what is being talked about, right? That's what's being emphasized in these hyperbolic sentences in which God says, destroy everything, man, woman, children, the animals, etc., etc. That's basically the main purpose. So that's, I will say, I would say that pretty much, yeah, that pretty much goes over everything that I want to say. So we can move to the third argument, the third claim, which is about the resurrection. So I want to see what's going on with the chat. I think Oh, thank you, Josh Betts, for the $2 super chat. Strong points. Keep it up. Thank you. Thank you for the support. Really appreciate it. Do you refer to the Nephilim? Okay, so just because it's talked about in the Book of Enoch doesn't mean that just because a non-canonical source speaks of something doesn't mean that it's untrue, right? There's, I think, the New Testament. I'm pretty sure quotes, for example, the Book of Enoch. Even I think it's in Epistle to Jude. I might be wrong, but I think it was in Jude. You have this reference. So it's important to kind of delineate that. And again, whether it's canonical or not, which it isn't canonical, doesn't change the fact that this is part of Christian tradition, right? It's part of Christian tradition that goes even before the time of Christ's incarnation. So that's pretty much how I will see. That's pretty much what I. All right, people are having a. Okay, yeah, this is. Okay, yeah. People are just having a different conversation. So let's move on to claim number 3. I'll try to go over this stuff more quickly. I mean, this is claim number 3 is the claim is there's insufficient evidence to believe in the resurrection, but pretty much the whole debate. I mean, to be honest, I don't even really want to go over this because they didn't even debate about the resurrection. They kind of just debated about whether the gospel authors are reliable. And the general trend, the general theme that I noticed is that Alex doesn't like the fact that there are semantic discrepancies between the gospel authors. He doesn't like the fact. He thinks this is the fact that they are not as reliable as Christians think they are. This is just a bad argument because, especially in legal context, perfect semantic correspondence between different testimonies is actually indication that there's guilt, that there's some kind of planning involved in order just to make the narrative cohesive, right? I think there's an example. I forgot the exact names, so this is not a good example, but I think there's a record in, I think this is when the Declaration of Independence was signed, and there's a source that says X person is making the speech, and another source that says Y person is making the speech, right? So it's kind of like saying, well, we can't trust these narrators because they're saying completely two different things. But then it turns out actually both are true. X, in this case, again, I don't remember the name, but people, American people that know their history, they can pretty much, I think they can provide the names. I think you guys know who I am talking about. X's voice just couldn't be heard because he had throat issues or something like that. So the other person spoke for him, right? He spoke for him. So in this case, both of the narratives are true, even though there is semantic discrepancy. So semantic discrepancy between different testimonies is just, it's actually very natural. It's something that you will expect. What you don't want to have in terms of scripture is this kind of, a discrepancy in meaning. Okay, what's the discrepancy in meaning? The discrepancy between what actually the gospel authors are trying to convey. That's what you don't want. But semantic discrepancy does not entail actual discrepancy in the events that actually happened. And another problem that I see is that Alex is in this like weird phase where he affirms that they're somewhat reliable. The gospel authors are somewhat reliable, except when they're not, right? So like they're kind of this in between stage. Why? Because they don't conform to his standard of uniform kind of explanation. So, for example, one of the arguments that he makes is that I'm not even going to go to the specifics because I think these are just general. Like these are problems in terms of generalities. Okay. For example, this gospel author talks about this event, but this other gospel author does not talk about this event. So which one are we supposed to believe, right? Again, there are many reasons why it might have just not been referred to, and it's a very strange kind of argument of silence. Speaking of argument of silence, they do talk about this, and his point is, if you're talking about something really interesting and specific, you will expect them to include that. For example, the Pompeii destruction, right? Uh, so an argument that I want to talk about right now is he argues that many people appeared to the common people after Christ's resurrection. Right? That's what Matthew records. Um, if this really happened, he says he basically says, I don't think this happened. And his reasoning is this: if this happened, it will be super extraordinary and everyone will record it. Again, an argument from silence, an argument from, like, basically you're designing uh, your modern standards of evidence in ancient times. It just doesn't work that way. Many of the things that we have, that we know about historical events, are written way later in ways that we don't want to know, the methods in which we don't want to know as moderns, that doesn't correspond to our sensibilities. Why? Because of the printing press. Okay, people really need to understand that things after the printing press and before the printing press were incredibly different, right? In terms of recording history and understanding who said what and what was believed and so on and so forth. And it's not a surprise that after the printing press you get a lot of this textual criticism. Textual criticism is just a technological. It's basically a mismatch of your expectation of today not corresponding properly as the way you wanted in terms of the standards of the past, right? Prior to the printing press. You want everything to correspond to the way in which it worked in the printing press. You want everything to correspond to the way in which you work so hard in writing your college academic papers. You have to cite these sources so specifically, and when you see historical sources not doing the exact same thing, you get really mad and really angry that they don't correspond to that standard. They're not supposed to correspond to that standard because things were incredibly different in the past than it is today. A lot of people really need to understand this, and I think Alex doesn't really understand that. And I think that's the main problem that he has. And if he understood this, he won't really have any issues. And I don't think he will even really need to be making an argument that there's these kinds of discrepancies, somewhat discrepancies, and I just don't like that. I want everything, like, if something extraordinary happens, all of the gospel authors have to say this, right? If John records Christ saying that Christ is the I am, all of the gospel authors should have recorded it. I'm sorry, but they're not supposed to obey your standards of evidence. Okay, they're not supposed to obey what you want, whatever your standards is. What you're supposed to do is you're supposed to align your standards of evidence consistently, whether we're talking about the gospel, whether we're talking about any other historical fact. And the fact of the matter is, the arguments about what Christ said, what Christ did, and is recorded for in terms of the eyewitnesses or his contemporaries. I mean, that's this strongest kind of evidence that we have in history, right, prior to the printing press, right? Strongest kind of evidence. And the only way you can kind of go against this, if you super arbitrarily try to pit the harmonious narrative of the gospel authors against each other. Why? Because you don't accept that they can be harmonious, right? You basically assume that they have to conflict, not be in harmony. And then you argue that the ones who assume that it is harmonious are making an unjustified assumption. No, actually, it's a very justified assumption, by the way. It's an incredibly justified assumption by the fact that they are people who are working for a common religious cause. That's enough of an assumption to think that they are working in harmony, right? You're supposed to give very good reasons for why you should pit what they say against each other. And so there's a simultaneous case in which there's this modern understanding, there's this like radical past understandings, like, oh, they didn't have any contacts or anything that's like related them to each other. I mean, word of mouth and tradition, I mean, that this is something that people really held to strongly. I mean, this is believed, for example, you see this in ancient Greek history. If you study ancient Greek history, like Sparta, Athens, one of the points that you will hear people make is that, like, in terms of the reliability and the consistency of the law code that you see between Sparta and Athens, which one, remained pure, right? Which ones changed where the other ones remained? Because in Sparta, it was word of mouth. Whereas in Athens, it's a written constitution. Well, actually, the written constitution was debated about and modified around much more. It was less stable compared to the Spartan constitution, because it's a nomos, right? It's the part of the way of life, right, that the people participated in. So I will say these are considerations that one should take legitimately. Now, let's talk about a bit. Let's talk a little bit about some of the particular cases. Right, the particular case of right, like what happened after the resurrection of Christ. Um, so the way I will say, okay, why don't you see any reporting aside from the argument of silence? I want to give. Here's my own theory, and I will say my theory is also, at the very least, as consistent as his theory, which is that the gospel are just made stuff up, right? Which, Matthew made stuff up to make sense that Jesus was the firstborn of the dead. Which, okay, right? That's only an atheist, only someone who's already committed to atheism will think that's a good argument. Um, but here is something that even a neutral can understand. Okay, this is something that you can actually accept, right? Because of the presupposition of, I will say, not the presupposition of harmony. Sorry, because of what actually Scripture itself says. So in Luke 16:31, you have Abraham telling the the rich man, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be persuaded, even if someone rises from the dead. So that's one thing that we need to keep it in the background. And another example is John 12:28-29. Father, glorify thy name. Then came there a voice from heaven saying, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. The people therefore that stood by and heard it said that it thundered. Others said an angel spake to him. Now again, Nathan is going to say, "Oh, I think this is just, again, he's just making this stuff up," and this is the way in which he tries to explain it after the fact when people are making this argument against it. This is the gospel author trying to, again, it's really, I don't think it's really convincing. What we're supposed to be looking at this in this sense is that the people that the resurrected people appeared to, I will say most of them, a big part of them, a big chunk of them are already believers, right? Because in Christianity, we do believe like faith has some kind of actual effect in which you can see certain things, whereas an unbeliever, whether even a very strong evidence comes to that unbeliever, is going to remain unconvinced, no matter what. We see this many, many different times, like the Pharisees, again with John 12, right? The God spoke, God himself literally speaks, and the people around it, they heard a thunder, right? They didn't hear someone speaking, they just heard a thunder, right? Because of the state in which they were. And so the state in which some people were, it's natural that they won't see the people walking around the streets in terms of resurrection, but still, I will say a good chunk saw. And again, they don't have to conform to the standard of evidence where someone else who's writing at the time reporting, this crazy thing happened in Jerusalem. I mean, look, here's something that we need to consider. Probably around that time in the Roman Empire, there are a bunch of crazy things happening all over the world. Okay, crazy things happening all over the world. Too many to count, too many to be recorded. Many of them might have even been recorded. We just don't have access to them, right? It's been more than 2,000 years. It's been, again, more than 2,000 years, and you're asking for it to conform. Look, be a bit more mature, please. I think it's really silly. These arguments, to me, it's always really silly. To some people, it might not be, but to me, like these kinds of arguments, like nitpicking about historical details, it's super silly to me. Super unnecessary. Like you don't need to do this. Okay, you really, like if I was an atheist, this is not the way in which I will try to argue, right? I won't try to argue in this way if I was an atheist, to be honest with you. To me, I think there's many, like just again nitpicking about what each gospel order said. So let's look at my other notes. Another particular case before I move on to the fourth claim, which I want to talk extensively. He talks about like when did the crucifixion exactly happen, and that there's a discrepancy between Mark and John. So I'll read this passage. This was written by someone on the Discord, the Orthodox Christian Discord, and I thought it was a good point. So I'll just basically read it because I think it pretty much answers the issue, I think, quite well, right? Like why there's this semantic discrepancy between John and Mark in terms of like the time in which Jesus was crucified. So the crucifixion was on Friday. This is what he wrote. The crucifixion was on Friday, the day of preparation. The Sabbath was a high day or feast day, i.e., Passover, right? Matthew 27:62. That happens the morning after the crucifixion. Mark 15:42 states that Jesus was buried that same evening by Joseph. That means he was buried the night of Friday before the Sabbath. This is corroborated by Luke 23, verses 53 to 55, and John 19:14, John 19:31, and John 19:42. The mystical supper is not, and this is the key point, is not in fact the Passover meal. It is a feast breaking the fast of the firstborn son, the redemption of the firstborn son, whereby the life of the firstborn is bought using silver. So you can find this on Wikipedia as well. Like, look into this. This is the feast that was going on. So that's, so you can check that out, right? So that was the meal, the fast of the feastborn, fast of the firstborn, right? That was what was being broken, and it's very interesting what this is about. Judas's betrayal is a fulfillment of this feast. So the betrayal happened in the evening of Thursday, corresponding to our Holy Week services of the washing of the disciples' feet, which is technically in the Jewish counting Friday, aka the beginning of Nisan 14. Jews also included the beginning day of the journey in the overall counting of the journey, even if it was not a full day. Nisan 14 is the day of the crucifixion, as Christ's crucifixion began at the third hour, 9 a.m. Now the lambs were killed on the day of preparation, starting at the third hour and going until the ninth. Hence, this is how long Christ endured the cross. He died at the ninth hour. Thus, Nisan 14 is included in the third 3 days. Nisan 15 is Holy Saturday, the Passover, where his body rested in the tomb. Matthew 28:1 says that after the Sabbath, on the first day of the week, the resurrection happened. That is well within the third day of the Jewish counting. So, something that's like, again, the fast of the firstborn, I think there was something about, let me find it here. Give me a second, please. I'll look into this another time, but that's basically, I will say, how a good response to the issue. And then finally, another semantic discrepancy. Alex claims that the two thieves were both mocking Christ, right? So one of the accounts, right, you have Saint Dismas, right, the thief that confesses and converts, right, on the cross, or thief on the cross. Whereas in another account, both the thieves are mocking him. So which one is right? Again, it's very likely that Saint Dismas was initially mocking him, and then when certain things started to happen, he started to realize, oh, this is real, and converted. So this is not again. So another there's many examples. Like, people use very basic examples. I feel like I don't even need to use these examples because, like, look, I'm not a super social butterfly by any means, but I do have a good understanding of the way in which certain words are used and within certain contexts that might seem contradictory, that are not contradictory in reality. So an example that people use for this is that, like, you have X person seeing two dogs in the park and Y person talking about one of the dogs in the park, like one dog in the park doing this, right? That's a semantic discrepancy. Does that mean that one of them is telling something false? No, it's just that Y is emphasizing something in further detail. It doesn't mean that he's contradicting what X is talking about. So I think, again, I already talked about, so I didn't need to bring it up again. It's an argument from silence and an unjustified assumption that the gospel accounts are supposed to not be, you're just assuming that the gospel accounts are not supposed to be complementary. And like treating each of the eyewitnesses in their own. Okay, I understand that this is the method of textual criticism, like historical criticism. Okay, I understand that's the method, but the problem is that the method itself, you need to understand and evaluate properly how well that method is going to be able to reach to certain conclusions, and what those conclusions entail, right? Like, ironically, the extraordinary claims require extraordinary proofs, like thing that atheists use, which, I mean, that's not a good argument, but I will say, I mean, it in a sense it applies to this, because the claim that the historical critic that is trying to prove that the gospel has just made all of this up has a much bigger burden of proof to address, I would say. Because what they're asking of the Christian is that you need to explain that all of these gospel authors like are saying the exact same thing in certain ways, and that they have to say it in the way that I want them to say, even if their aim is not to do that. So they're asking you to go above and beyond of what you're supposed to do. And I don't think that's legitimate. And frankly, look, I'll be completely straightforward. My personal standards of evidence, even if you're talking about supernatural things, is very light. It's not like I want to say super light. I will say it's lighter than what most people think. For example, when like I don't like the like Muhammad didn't exist argument that some people make. To me, I think it's really silly. I think there's a lot of extraordinary proofs that you need to make. Now, of course, when the Muslims are using these art like again these presuppositions and assumptions against Christians, it's good to see it being turned to them, right? So it's legitimate in this way, but to me it's like it's pretty clear. I think it's pretty clear that he existed. It's pretty clear. I will say, um, a lot of the things that he claimed happened. Um, he thinks they happened in the way they happened. I think these are not like super what you're supposed to be discussing is that okay, what actually happened and how do we understand that, right? And how do we delineate that? Not by looking at, oh, there's this kind of discrepancy in the text. No, it's by looking at, okay, um, for example, he's claiming to be in continuity with the Old Testament, but then he says that the Old Testament is not the real Old Testament. That is the real secret Old Testament that we're supposed to abide by. And so for example, from that, you're supposed to conclude, okay, this person is making that analysis himself. He's contradicting with himself. So the conclusion is that he has no continuity with the Old Testament. Or if he has, we can never know, right? It's one of those two conclusions. I think that's a much better and a much more honest. It's a much more honest way of arguing, right? Like if you're an atheist, I think it's much more honest to say, look, it could be the case that the gospel authors and even Jesus himself really believed he was God, but XYZ reasons, right? Like why I don't think this is the case, right? In terms of like, it's just not, for example, possible for these supernatural events to happen. You might just say supernatural events are just impossible to happen. There must have been some other explanation, no matter how crazy, that we still haven't found yet. Um, that I respect a lot more, and I think is a much better argument than all of this what you see like again with this historical hand wringing. So let's move on to claim number 4, and I think this is super spicy, and I think this is also super unnecessary. It's very strange, and I want to kind of go over some of these things. So claim number 4: Jesus never claimed to be God. Now I want to explain Alex's position a little bit. So he's not saying the gospel. So he thinks that one can. It's reasonable to think that the gospel authors really did believe Jesus was God. That Saint Paul did believe and was trying to tell that Jesus was God, which is kind of strange because okay, so they are our sources about Jesus Christ, and he admits that they are in some capacity our sources, but then he says we're not supposed to believe them in this regard. We can believe them in other regards. Yeah, that sounds very like nitpicky. That sounds super nitpicky. That doesn't sound like a well structured, internally consistent way of approaching the Gospels. Um, and another example is like he says John is the least reliable gospel author. Why? Because the Matthew, Mark, Luke, they pretty much talk about similar things, but John talks about very different things. And I will expect the other gospel authors to talk about the same things as well. Again, no one they don't have to abide by that standard. What you're supposed to show is whether that standard is legitimate, right? You can like the standard; it could be convincing to you. For you, this could be the way that could convince you. It should be in this exact way, then I will be convinced. But they don't have to conform to that standard. And the reason why they don't have to conform to that standard is because of the presupposed harmony in the first place, in line with the oral tradition that existed at the time, that is still present on this day, that is preserved and present in the Orthodox Church, which is an argument. I think someone, most likely a Roman Catholic, tried to make this argument. I think it was a much better point than most of the people that were making it. Of course, everyone like raised the flag afterwards because most of them were Protestants, right? Most of the people involved in that debate. So I just think, again, you need to have. I can turn this around. For me, the standard, you need to show some really good evidence that John is unreliable. Aside from the fact that he talks about very different things and try to make arguments about, John was one of the last apostles and so on and so forth. And again, it's all super circumstantial evidence. It won't really, like, these kinds of evidences. Like, imagine imagine you tried to make the same kind of argument in a court of law, like about any case, right? Like, just saying, oh, it just happened to be the case that this person is the oldest one amongst this group, and this is exactly why he did X or whatever. Like, the judge will look at you and just say, how is that supposed to be a conclusive evidence? That seems super circumstantial, right? Like, that, the judge won't be, I don't think any judge will be convinced by that kind of argumentation, and no one should. But even when he accepts the Gospel of John, he basically argues, yeah, Jesus never claimed to be God. So then, for example, you cite John 1:1, or someone really excellently, I think, pointed out that, make way for the Lord, and this is a signification for God, and this applied to Christ. I mean, all of the Gospels use this, so isn't this a clear example that the Gospel authors claim that Jesus is God? And Alex's argument is, yeah, but I'm talking about whether Jesus himself claimed to be God. Okay, so this is a very important aspect in which we can understand how Jesus refers to himself as God, because this is why you need to understand at least some critical aspects of Christian theology, and also be familiar with the scriptures in a deep way, not in the way of where can I find some inconsistency or anything like that. No, you're supposed to study it in the way that it wants to be expressed and studied, so that you at the very least understand the point that it's making. Because if you don't do that, then you're going to completely miss the evidence of how Christ himself is saying that he is God. And in terms of John 8:58, right? Like, Christ says, I am. So he makes a very just horrible argument, like horrible argument. Uh, he says in the Greek, it just says ego eimi, just says, I am this person. It is I am. It is I. And when he gives the example of him walking on water, and he says ego eimi too. Does that mean he's using the I am? Actually, it actually does mean he's using I am. And I think I refer to the verse. Yeah, and actually, there is a Psalm 77:19. Thy way is in the sea, and thy path in the great waters, and thy footsteps are not known. Right. So that's actually a fulfillment of what we see in Psalm 77:19. So actually, Christ does refer to himself as I am when he's walking on water. But even aside from that, it's a really bad argument, because, okay, the Greek is ego eimi, but Christ is conversing with the Jews. He's saying, before Abraham was, I am. So Christ is very clearly claiming that he is a pre-existent being. And he says, Abraham saw my day and was glad. How did Abraham see Christ's day, right? So in what way really did Abraham see Christ, right? Because when Christ said, Abraham saw my day and was glad, the Jews rightfully understood that he claimed that Abraham saw him. And then Christ, what does Christ say? Does Christ say, no, I'm just a Messiah. I'm just a human created Messiah in this specific time and space. I'm not some eternal being. I'm just in this specific timeline. You just misunderstood me incorrect. No, he says, before Abraham was, I am. Right? So before Abraham was, I existed, to confirm that Abraham saw him. But how could Abraham see him? So let's take a look at Genesis 18, right? This is the famous Trinity icon, right? The scene of the Trinity icon. Um, I'll say this first two verses. And the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre, and he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day. And he lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself toward the ground and said, my Lord. So, okay, let's stop. So the 3 men, right? My Lord. So one of the 3 men is the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, it's not just this, right? There's other things that happen within Genesis 18, but I want to get into the the relevant passage. in Genesis 19, you have the two angels that was with the Lord going down to Sodom, right? And it is the Lord, right? The Lord remains with Abraham. The Lord remains and talks with Abraham in Genesis 18:22. And the man turned their faces from thence and went toward Sodom. But Abraham stood yet before the Lord, right? So Genesis 18:22. Okay, the two men left. Where they go? They go to Sodom. Genesis 19, two angels to Sodom, right? So those are the two men. The one that remained is the Lord, and he's speaking to Abraham, right? So this is what Christ is claiming. He's claiming that he is the Lord. But what does it mean that he is the Lord, right? And someone made this reference, but again, he didn't stand strong enough. Genesis 19:24. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. This is the Lord that talked with Abraham, right? That Abraham basically prayed to, interceded, for Lot, right? Abraham interceded for Lot so that the Lord saves Lot from Sodom. This is the Lord. He rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. Wait a second. The Lord, so we had the Lord talking to Abraham, raining upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. So there's a Lord that's talking to Abraham, Lord out of heaven. Now, what's the term Lord that's used in the Hebrew? Yahweh. It's the term Yahweh that's being used. It's not Yahweh and Adonai or Elohim or whatever. No, it's Yahweh. Yahweh is specifically for God. So there are two Yahwehs, two personal subjects with the same divine name. And divine names are exclusive to God alone, right? The Lord is my name, and I will give my glory to no other. I think it's Isaiah 42:8, right? That God says this. So, and the angel of the Lord further down, in this, the narrative of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, you had the angel of the Lord who has the divine name, right? See in Exodus 23, right? God says, my name is in him, right? And what is the name of God? The Lord is my name, right? Yahweh is my name. And so the name Yahweh is in the angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord is a pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. And we can even go further in terms of Isaiah 9:6 that talks about the Messiah being God. And I'm not just referring to one of the titles of the Messiah being God, which is El in Hebrew. Wonderful, right? Wonderful is a title that's being used for God. So let's go to Judges 13:18 and see what the angel of the Lord says to him. And the angel of the Lord said unto him, why dost thou ask it my name? For it is wonderful, right? So the angel of the Lord, which is the pre-incarnate Logos, right? The pre-incarnate Jesus Christ, who has God's divine name in him, right? God's divine name, one of those names that the angel has, even if you don't believe that the angel, even if you believe for some silly reason that the angel is a created, the angel in this specific passage is a created normal angel. Even if you believe that, Scripture does say that the name is in the angel. One of those names is wonderful, right? Exclusive to God, right? That's the name that God has. The Messiah also have, right? Wonderful. So you have this, but I want to kind of get back to Genesis 19:24. Again, you have two Yahwehs at hand here. So when Christ is saying this to the Jews, right, before Abraham was I am, this is the reference. He's making this reference, right? He's saying that when Abraham saw his day, it's not just referring to Abraham seeing what's going to happen in the future and he's happy that the Messiah is going to come and save everyone. No, it's also, look, Abraham literally saw me. And so when Alex O'Connor says, oh, it's just I am, like it's just some general, like it's a me, Mario, right? Like Christ is not saying it's a me, Jesus. He's not saying this. Okay, he's saying something much deeper. It's insane how he can actually think this is a good argument. It's like you would expect someone as well read as him to not make this bad argument. Like, but there's no answer to this, to the point you unfortunately have to impute ill motives as any reason. And if Alex doesn't want ill motives to be imputed on him because he made this stupid argument, well, then maybe he should lighten up his standards for the gospel orders, because I'm using the same standard. I'm not saying he is ill motives. I mean, well-read people can make very basic mistakes. I've made many basic mistakes in my life, but I'm not super intelligent, so I'm not a good example. Um, but anyways, to get back to the point, you have this connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament in this sense. And let's talk about the Old Testament as well, right? The Trinity is taught in the Old Testament. I mean, again, this is something that it's very important to point out. I mean, Psalm 33:6 is a very clear case of this. Um, Psalm 36 says, "By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, and all the hosts of them by the breath of his mouth." So, breath is spirit in Hebrew, word, right? Logos, right? The logos of the Lord. Through the logos of the Lord, the heavens were made, and all the hosts of them by the spirit of his mouth, the spirit proceeding from his mouth, right? From the mouth of the Lord. That's what you see in Psalm 33:6. That's a clear example of the Trinity. I mean, you have Psalm 104:30. Thou sendest forth thy spirit, they are created. So when the Holy Spirit is sent, things are created. The Spirit, God's Spirit, is not created. Okay, God's Spirit is not a created thing, because then it will be sent by something something other. It will be sent by itself. Similarly, the Word is not created, because everything's created through the Word. If the Word is a creation, then it will be created through itself, right? It's the same situation. You have Psalm 2:7, especially the Septuagint makes this very, very clear, that Psalm 2:7 is that. Sorry, it's not Psalm 2:7. Well, Psalm 2:7 is also a good verse, but there's also another psalm that talks about, like, before the morning star, the dew of the light, I have begotten you, something like that. I think it's Psalm 2:7. I declare, decreed, the Lord that said unto me, thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee. So today, in Hebrew idiom, is a reference to eternity. So the eternal generation of the Son. You have Proverbs, I think Proverbs 7. Right, 7:22. Sorry, 8:22. So Proverbs 8, right? Proverbs 8. You have a reference to the incarnation. The Lord possessed me in the beginning of his way, before his works of old. The works of old being the work of salvation of God, right? This is a prophecy about what's going to happen in the future, right? The incarnation. People use this to say, "Oh, the Lord possessed me," which also made me, right? That's another meaning of the term. Oh, so Christ was made, Christ was created. Actually, if you look at Proverbs 8:25, before the mountains were settled, before the hills was set forth, I was brought forth, right? The Greek use the word begotten, right? So before the mountains were settled, that is, before all creation was made, I was begotten, right? Wisdom was begotten from the Father, right? So that's Jesus Christ. There's other verses. I mean, I have an entire video on the angel of the Lord. Like, I didn't even talk about the angel of the Lord. Like, I mean, there's so many examples of the angel of the Lord, like talking as if he is God, like being treated as if he is God, speaking in terms of authority. And we see this also with Christ in the New Testament, speaking with authority in many different examples, where we can talk about the paralytic, right? The paralytic, right? Christ forgives the sins of the paralytic, and the Jews, the Pharisees, say, "How can you forgive someone's sins? Only God can forgive sins." And what does Christ respond? Christ responds by saying, "Look, I can forgive sins, and I will prove it to you by raising this man up." And that's exactly what he does, right? He uses the miracle of raising the paralytic to show that he has the power also to forgive sins, because the Son of Man has the power to forgive sins. And again, with the Daniel 7 motive of the Son of Man riding on the clouds, again, that's a divine attribution that God stole, right? Deliberately took and appropriated from Baal, used it for himself, that he commands the clouds, right? That he is the one that is truly commanding the clouds, not Baal, that he is the one commanding the clouds. And the Son of Man also likewise, it's commanding the clouds, and he's coming on the clouds, and Christ identifies himself as the Son of Man in Daniel 7. And there's this ascension narrative as well, I will say. These are some of the verses that you can kind of think. I mean, there's other verses like, the Lord said to my Lord, sit thou at my right hand, I'll make it your footstool. There's also in Matthew 21:16. I think I lost this. I hope I didn't, because I think I lost this reference. But again, like in Matthew 21, when Christ enters Jerusalem, right? And the children are saying Hosanna to the Son of David, right? The Pharisees were displeased, and Christ said unto him, Hearest thou what these say? And Jesus said unto them, the Pharisees said unto, hearest thou what these say, right? Make these children stop. And Christ says, yeah, have you never read, out of the mouth of the babes and sucklings thou hast perfected praise. So if you go at Psalm 8, right, let's take a look at Psalm 8. Out of the mouth of babes and sucklings hast thou ordained strength because of thine enemies, that thou mightest still the enemy and the avenger, right? So who is this referring to? Psalm 8:1 has the answer. O Lord, how excellent is thy name in all the earth, who has set thy glory above the heavens. So Christ is basically saying, the Pharisees, when they're telling Christ, stop these children from praising you, Christ is saying, haven't you heard? Out of the mouth of babes and sucklings thou hast perfected praise, referring to Psalm 8. Who is Psalm 8 referring to? God. So what is he saying? Look, they're doing exactly what they're supposed to do. Don't stop them. And so these are just some of the examples. I mean, Lord said unto my Lord, sit up now at my right hand, I will make it thy footstool. I think that's another example that one can use, although I think it's to differentiate between the person of the Trinity. There's Yahweh, and there's also, I think Elohim was used. I might be wrong, but these are some of the words that you can kind of think of. I think it's good enough to kind of at least start thinking that Christ actually does refer to himself as God very clearly. But I also more so want to respond to, Alex says, these are references, but look at the other references that shows that Christ is not God. So let's look at the other references. So in the case of Stephen, right, he cites the martyrdom of Stephen, that Stephen sees Christ with the Father, and he says, look, he's separating Jesus from God. No, he's just distinguishing between the persons of the Trinity. That's the mere distinction of the person of the Trinity. And he was, again, charged by account of blasphemy, right? Believing that just a mere created human being is the Messiah is not really blasphemy, right? And that's a point that the Mormon made, which, the person you don't like, heartbreaking. The person you don't like made an excellent point. I was I don't like him. I don't like him. I don't know him. So I'm just joking. But he cites a doxology of Saint Paul, who refers to the Father as the one God and Christ as Lord. Okay, so here's a very great example to show that this is not a good argument. So if Christ is not God, because it's referring to the Father as the one God, and Christ is the Lord beside him, so does this mean that the Father is not Lord? It's as simple as that, right? So by this logic, the Father is not Lord, which doesn't make any sense. So you have to allow for interchangeability of terms. And the reason why the Father is the one God is because he is the fount of divinity, right? The ho theos, God with definite article, is used for him in various different instances to specify him from the other persons of the Trinity. So the biblical kind of language, the semantic language of the Trinity, is you have God, his word, and his spirit, which is exactly what you see in St. John Damascus as well, right? God, his word, and his spirit are one God. That's the doctrine of the Trinity. The Father is the God, right, that you can kind of speak of. But in terms of the Son and the Holy Spirit, they are God, because they have the same divinity that the Father has, right? So the divine name of that divinity is God. That's why the Trinity is one God. In the difference, in the sense of subject, right, in terms of proper name, right, that will be a distinguishing mark of him as a person. And the Father is God in this sense that we use. But of course, the Son is the image of God, and so he has the same names as God, being God. And the Holy Spirit likewise is the image of the Word, which is a bit of an aside. It's funny that in terms of the filioque debates, this is very much used by Roman Catholics as if it's supposed to prove the filioque. It's funny because I was just reading from one of the Matins prayers in church, and the Holy Spirit being the image of the Son is actually in Orthodox liturgics. So this is actually a point that you see in Orthodox liturgics as well. I didn't even notice that, but I noticed this a couple of weeks ago. He cites Christ saying, "The Father is greater than I am," which that's, as St. Gregory the theologian says, that's a reference to the Father as being in terms of relation, right? In terms of speaking about in terms of relation of cause, right? The Father is the cause because he generates, he begets the Son, right? He begets the Son. In that sense, the Father is greater than he is. And also, you can also allow for this in reference to his humanity. So there's two ways, like both ways are good. They're consistent with the Trinitarian account. He argues Christ doesn't know the hour. This is just okay. A lot of people really make a lot about this. This is just Christ simply avoid, like he's basically saying, I don't want to speak about the hour, right? I'm not going to tell you the time of my second coming. I'm not going to tell you when all of these things happen. That's for my Father to know. That's basically him saying, you're not getting it out of me. Ask the Father if you want to know. And the only way the Father's going to let you know is through me. So you're not going to find out about this. That's basically what he's saying. Again, I think you'd think that people will. I mean, we kind of see this. Maybe it's a near Eastern thing. I mean, I am part of a Near Eastern culture, so to me it seems very natural. He argued, I'll respond to this. My God, why have you forsaken me? Okay, again, this is, it's shocking that he makes such bad arguments. I mean, any academic that uses my God, why have you forsaken me as an argument against the divinity of Christ is a fraud, to be honest. Like, it's a fraudulent argument. I'll refine what I said in this way. It's a fraudulent argument. It's an argument of fraudable use. It's a really bad argument. It's honestly, at this point, it's a dishonest argument, because if you're supposed to be an expert on Christianity, you're supposed to know that this is a citation of Psalm 22. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? He's making a reference to Psalm 22. Now, what makes Psalm 22 relevant is verse 16. For dogs have compassed me, the assembly of the wicked have enclosed me, they pierced my hands and my feet. So, yeah, pierced my hands and my feet. It's a reference to the crucifixion, right? It's a reference to, he's citing Psalm 22 to say that he fulfilled also Psalm 22, right? What it's talking about, right? It's fulfilled. I may tell all my bones, they look and stare upon me. They part my garments among them and cast lots upon my vesture. But be not thou far from me, O Lord, O my strength, haste thee to help me. Deliver my soul from the sword, my darling from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth. The lion's mouth, right, is referring to death. For thou hast heard me from the horns of the unicorns. I will declare thy name unto my brethren. In the midst of the congregation will I praise thee. Ye that fear the Lord, praise him. All ye seed of Jacob, glorify and fear him. All the seed of Israel, so on and so on and so on, right? And when he is citing this, the Jews, especially the Pharisees, listening to this, they know, oh, he's trying to say this, right? They know the Old Testament, just as, at least as well as Alex does. So I don't understand why Alex uses this argument. It's a shockingly bad argument. It's an argument you will try to use to trick someone that's new to Christianity to make them not Christian. It's only an argument that you will use to do that. It's not an argument that, if you really believe that, if you really think this is a good argument, I'd really be interested to hear why. Because it doesn't do the work that you want it to do. These are the arguments that he uses. I mean, he could use other arguments as well, right? Like the Father is the only true God, which is separating him from false deities. It's not separating him from himself. And Christ himself says, in John 17:5, 2 verse later, now Father, glorify thou me with thine own self, with the glory which I had with thee before the world was. So this is something that we need to kind of think. Okay, this is not just a mere claim of being eternal or eternal creation, as Arians will say. Glorify thou me with thine own self, with the glory which I had with thee before. So wait a sec. So Christ eternally, as what Christ is saying is that he eternally had the same glory with the Father, and now he's asking that glory to be given to him. So he eternally has the same glory, which is a statement that he's God. Only God can have the glory of the Father, right? The glory unique to God alone. Only God can have that. So that's one point. The second point is he's asking the Father to give it to him. So you already have it. So why are you asking the Father to give it to him? Because he wants this glory not for his divinity, but for his humanity. He's asking for the glory to be manifested in his humanity. That's what this prayer is. So, he could use John 73, but it's still a huge problem, and it's still Christ in his own words saying that he is God. And any argument, like in terms of like, again, Alex talking about, look, he's separating God from Christ. Look, again, you need to understand the way in which the term God is used in the Bible is, for the most part, as a proper name that specifies the person of the Father, right? This does not mean that Christ is not God in the sense of having divinity as natural to him, as proper to his nature. Does not mean that. It does not. It does not mean that Christ does not have the same divinity as the Father. It doesn't mean that, right? That they are separated in terms of who they are as persons, conceptually, of course. So, yeah, I mean, this is pretty much. I mean, these are the notes that I had, and yeah, and another argument that he makes. Yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention this. Psalm 82. He says, look, okay. He says that he and the Father is one, and that he is God. And he says, he cites Psalm 82 and says, look, ye are gods, right? So I'm just God in that sense. The problem with this citation is that if you look at the later verse, it says the latter verse, but ye shall die like men and fall like one of the princes. This is a reference to the demons. Okay, he's talking to the psalm is talking to the demons. So if Christ is God in the sense of fallen demons, then he's basically saying he's a demon, which is ridiculous. Okay, that's not what he's saying. So what we see later in John 10, right? Let's take a look. Right, like I and the Father are one. Then he says, is it not written in your law, I said, ye are gods? If ye call them gods, unto whom the word of God came, and the scripture cannot be broken, say ye of him whom the Father has sanctified and sent into the world. So he's saying, if even they are called gods, then why do you think I'm blaspheming because I said I'm the Son of God? And now here's the kicker: if I do not do the works of my Father, believe me not. But if I do, though ye believe not me, believe the works, that ye may know and believe that the Father is in me and I in him. So what is he saying? He is saying that the works that he's doing are the works of the Father. So he has this, and the term work, right? In Greek, I think it's ergon, right? It's comes from like vergon, right? Term work from English, German work, right? That comes right, ergon, right? And it's a form of the word energia, right? Activity, operation. So Christ is saying that I have the same activities, the same operations, right, of my nature as the Father does. The only one that can have the same works as the Father is God. Only someone who has the same nature as the Father, as God, can do the works of God. Can a created human being do the works of God? Can a created being say that God's works testify me? I mean, that will be a very ambitious created being to say that God is testifying for me by his works. No, it means that, like when he says, but if I do, though you believe not me, believe the works, that ye may know and believe that the Father is in me and I in him. So he has the same works, the same activities as the Father does, right? A created being cannot do the same activities as God does. It's as simple as that. So I think that's and the final thing that I wanted to point out is in terms of like a lot of these arguments, not the arguments that I made, but arguments that lesser arguments, I will say lesser arguments that people make. He says this is just convoluted, and this is why it's important. Again, it seems convoluted to you because, frankly, though you know a lot about the Christian scripture, you don't really know anything about the Christian scripture, right? In a theological sense. And that's the problem with this completely historical approach. The general historians, I think in general, all have this problem, is that they always analyze these events in terms of what historically specifically happened instead of like the real questions behind it. And so, again, I say this again, as I said in the beginning, to understand the New Testament, you need to understand the theology of the Old Testament. Then you will see that the many things that Christ is saying will become very clear, right? A lot of it will become clear. But just looking at the concepts that you see in the Old Testament will make the New Testament clear. And this is the way in which Christ speaks, right? Christ speaks in this way. Christ demonstrates that he's divine in this specific way. And so if you, and again, what does a historian do? The historian doesn't just separate the Old Testament from the New Testament. The historian separates each of the books of the Old Testament from each other, each of the books of the New Testament from each other, just completely separates them, and there's no any connectivity, any similarity. It's just going to be, right? Oh no, this connection and similarity cannot be a deliberate, it cannot be a connection or a point that God is making, because God doesn't exist. It has to be the author trying to fit this into something or some other like silly theory, right? That they're trying to make sense of. In other words, it's assuming atheism to prove atheism. It's assuming that Christianity is not true in order to prove that Christianity is not true. It's a dishonest way of arguing. And it's not a way that I would want to argue. If I'm arguing, again, for example, with a Muslim, I'm not going to say, I assume that Islam is false, therefore I'm going to use, of course, it's going to be a hidden assumption, and I'm going to use certain aspects of that assumption within my argument against you. At least to me, I think that's a dishonest way of going. I think it's much more honest to say, look, the claims you're making, these kinds of specific claims in history that you're making, and the kind of way you try to harmonize them, I'm going to accept that this is a way that you can do this. But let's look at what your system is saying and see whether it matches up, right? And I gave an example, right? Like in terms, like you claim validity from the Old Testament, but then either the Old Testament is corrupted and it's a fake Old Testament, there's a real Old Testament there somewhere that we don't know of. So either you don't have any connection with the Old Testament, or you have a connection with the Old Testament, we just never know. We'll just never know. It'll never be made clear, right? And it's and things of this kind of nature. I think that's a better way to kind of argue against really any worldview, any system. So that's pretty much what I had in mind. I mean, there's this also final note, right? Alex asked, why is God bound by the law of non-contradiction? It's, I mean, you're supposed to know this. I mean, a lot of theists do respond to, like, I don't know. I mean, this kind of stuff. I mean, if you were a kid, you will find it convincing. But like with things like law of non-contradiction, why is God bound? Again, let's say semantically bound by the law of non-contradiction because it's an aspect of his nature. Right? God doesn't go against himself. Right? God doesn't. If he went against himself, then he will be God. He will transform into some other being. Right? Like again, with the same case, God exists. Okay, God cannot cease to make himself exist. Right? It's something that goes against his own nature. To say that he can do that is to basically say, okay, at this point, you're not talking about God, you're talking about something entirely different. And even if whether you believe contradictions are meaningless, or whether you believe contradictions do have some kind of meaning or truth value, right? Whether kind of like, I think it still goes to the same conclusion that when we're speaking with God, when we talk about omnipotency, it just means infinitely actualizing everything that has potency. Everything that does not have potency cannot be actualized. That's basically it. Doesn't mean that things that have no potency cannot be actualized. So miracles have potency. They're just supernatural. They're just transcending beyond the laws of regular nature, right? But it doesn't contradict the laws of nature. Like with for example, the resurrection, there's various different ways in which maybe the molecules are coming back together the same exact way. You tack onto the soul, and voila, that's the resurrection. I mean, there's various natural explanations of these supernatural events, and the supernatural mechanism behind it is extraordinary because it's God doing this in an extraordinary way, right? It's extraordinary to us, right, from the human perspective. Anyways, that's pretty much. I think that pretty much response. I mean, these are all of the arguments that I've seen, that I've heard Alex make in that stream. Maybe there are other arguments that he makes in different videos, and that will be a topic for a different video. But pretty much all I had. And yeah, I think people are just talking about other things. So aside from the chat, I'll look at this giga super chat. I mean, this is not a super chat. This is a gigantic super chat. Thank you so much, Marco Kite. 30 British pounds. Really appreciate the donation. I owe my conversion from Rome to Orthodoxy to Jay Dyer and yourself, plus Pope Francis, the greatest living apologist for Orthodoxy. Thank you. If I've been of any help to you, then that's its own reward. Thank you for the support. Really, really appreciate it. Of course, if you want to do it sustained as well, you can check the Patreon. It has some bonus benefits as well. So have people saying good stream, good stream. Thank you. Good audience. I suppose I couldn't look at the chat as often, but I'll try to make these streams more regular, more you know easy to make, because I need to recover my conversational skills. I think my performance, I would say my performance was good, right? I think I was decent in this stream, especially compared to the last one. Um, so yeah, thank you to all watching, thank you to all supporting. Thank you to those who will be listening to this during your car ride, I suppose, or listening to this live, listening to the later recording. Um, Thank you to all of you, all of my supporters. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't, like, so this video goes out, right? Um, it's not just an expression of I like this video. It's also kind of an expression of support, right? You want the algorithm to see me and pick me up. And I'll see all of you in the next video or stream. Thank you. May God be with you all. Take care of yourselves, and goodbye. See you later.